Here we are. Hey, it's March 18th, and this is an interview with Michael Ryan. Okay, so it's the interview kind of has two parts. The first part, I just sort of ask about your current practices. It's based on the survey Collier and I did for an article about 2 years ago of like younger poets and how they work with digital media. So those are meant to be sort of short answer, just about how you save, how you title, stuff like that.
Sure.
And then we'll kind of talk more about the arc of your career and different ways ways your process has changed or not changed in accordance with history, technology, culture. So, if you don't mind, please state your name, date of birth, and where we are.
Michael Ryan, 24th of February, 1946, and I believe we're in Irvine, California.
So this is kind of how you work currently. What genres do you work in as a writer?
I write prose and poetry, essays, nonfiction, and mostly poems.
So your primary genre is poetry?
Yeah.
And I know these answers.
It's okay.
And some of this will be repetitive, and I don't, if it's like you're like, okay, I answered that, just tell me.
That's fine.
Okay. What kinds of devices do you own or have access to for your writing, in terms of computer devices?
Yeah, I have a desktop computer and then an iPad.
Okay.
I don't use the iPad much, but sometimes for internet stuff.
So do you have a desktop computer here? Do you have one also at your office that you work on?
I don't use it.
You don't use it? Okay.
Yeah.
So that's your main computer for composing?
That's pretty much,
okay.
Yeah.
And what operating system are you using?
Microsoft Word.
Okay. So is it a PC or a Mac?
It's a PC.
It's a PC, okay. And so you answered that question. Do you use computers exclusively for your work, or do you use both physical and digital environments?
What does that mean?
Do you work on paper and digitally? Do you go back and forth, or are you at the point where you work primarily on the computer? Or
I draft poems by hand, and then I'll go back to the computer and go sometimes back and forth. Prose I write on the computer.
Okay. And then is there a point during? Well, we'll talk about this later. At which point do you kind of like, if you're writing by hand, like when do you move to the computer?
Yeah, it depends. It seems to be finished enough to make a typed copy.
Okay. Do you have any pre-writing or notes to these things, or are they usually?
Yeah, it depends on the piece. They're all very different, but sometimes there's a lot of notes, sometimes there's not much. I don't usually take notes on the computer. I usually will do that by hand.
And do you save those pre-writing and notes? The physical copies, do you keep them somewhere?
I keep everything, yeah. And my papers are at the University of Virginia. So theoretically, someday I should be sending what's accumulated to them.
How do you save your digital files, like your poem files, etc.?
I try to do them in terms of the draft numbers, like I will save the title. Sometimes I'll put the date if it seems germane, but I will put numbers so that the first draft that goes on the computer is one, and so forth. Yeah.
And then do you save them all in one what's the folder system like? Are you saving them in just like a poetry folder, or?
Yeah. No, this one currently is Poems 2012 dash because that was when I finished my last book of poems. so they're kind of arranged by book.
And then so once you have the poem on the computer, do you ever print it out to revise it that way?
Yes.
Yes. And do you save paper copies of those drafts?
Yeah, well, usually
Usually.
I can get sloppy about it, but I try to save most.
How do you do that? Do you put them in files? Do you put them in boxes? Or?
For years I had my office is filled with stacks of brown boxes, as you might remember, and it's all a big mess and a big pile.
Some lucky archivist have like several months of work.
Yeah, lucky or perhaps not so lucky.
So were there also like brown bags too, or was it just boxes? I feel like I remember like paper bags.
No, there were not brown bags.
They were boxes.
That's
my memory.
Screen memory, Devin. You think I'm sloppier than I already am.
I picture you like with grocery bags full of your papers walking back and forth.
It's pathetic, but not quite that pathetic.
Do you back up your digital copies? Do you have some sort of do you put them on a hard drive somewhere else or anything?
No, I hope it has a backup system on it. I think it does.
Okay.
I think it backs it up automatically.
Okay. So you don't, are you using something like Dropbox or any of those?
No, I'm not.
Cloud things?
No.
Okay. And so once you're finished with the poem, how do you save that sort of finished piece? Does that go into a manuscript file, or what happens once you feel like the poem is done?
Well, again, when it's done, it's just number whatever. 15 of that particular poem, and it just stays in that folder until it's time for a book, and then I will transfer the final draft of everything into some other place so that, it's just the final drafts. And then there's always galleys and proofread stuff, and so that becomes a separate folder.
Okay. That's the quick digital
Alrighty.
beginning part of it, and now we'll kind of talk more, dramatically, with larger scope. So how long have you been writing professionally is the first question. And by professionally, I mean in a way that you are sort of supporting yourself or that it's led to jobs or something like that.
The first poem I published was in 1970, so 44 years.
Okay. What was your first published poem?
Actually, the first published poem that was in my first book was 1970. Before that, there were a couple, but the first one. The oldest poem in my New and Selected is a poem called Hitting Fungos.
Yeah, I like that. Would you please describe kind of the arc of your career, like kind of education all the way through what's your current kind of position?
I've been teaching all of that time.
Yeah. But you can, even before that, like your kind of education leading up to that too.
When I went to Notre Dame, there weren't any writing workshops. So I was an English major, and I was interested in being, I was the editor of the literary magazine at Notre Dame when I was a senior there. And I wrote extremely bad undergraduate poems. I then went to Claremont Graduate School in Claremont here, and was going to get a PhD in English, and was writing poems all of that time, and decided to leave after 3 semesters and dropped out, went to Cambridge, lived with some friends of mine, worked in a bookstore in Harvard Square. There's a funny story about after I quit at Claremont and was sort of a lame duck there. It was during the time of the Cambodia invasions, and it was a very charged political time. I had gone through Iowa City and expected that since I was a poet, all the faculty on the workshop would want to read my poems. So kindly, George Starbuck met with me, and I handed him a manuscript of poems, and he put it in his desk drawer. And we just talked for a few minutes, and that was it, and I left.
Yeah.
And after I quit the PhD program at Claremont, I got a letter from George Starbuck saying, "You're accepted to the workshop, why don't you apply?"
That's nice.
Wasn't it?
Yeah.
A miracle. Never could happen now,
No.
or even come close to such a thing. But he was a very sweet man, and apparently saw something in my poems, and so then I went to Iowa from 1970 to 74. I got an MFA there. I couldn't get a job after getting an MFA, so they kindly offered to put me up for another year. I worked on the Iowa Review as a poetry editor, and they said, if you're going to stay, you have to go back in the PhD program, because we have to have a way to give you graduate aid. And so I did that and worked on the Iowa Review. Still couldn't get a job after the next year, and the fourth year, between the summer of my, after my third year, I got a call from Yale University Press saying I won the Yale Series of Younger Poets. And so I went back to Iowa for a fourth year, finished up my PhD. They put me on the faculty for my last semester there. And then I went to Southern Methodist University from there for 4 years. I then directed the MFA program, which is now at Warren Wilson.
Okay.
While it was at Goddard, while the director, Ellen Voigt, had her Guggenheim year. From there, I was there 2 years, I guess. No, 1 year. And then I went to Princeton for 2 years, and to Charlottesville, Virginia. I taught at University of Virginia as a visitor, and also mostly at Warren Wilson for all those years. And then came here, and I've been here since 1991, University of California at Irvine.
All right.
Was that too long an answer?
No, that's exactly what I'm looking for.
Okay.
Just sort of start. This is what happened, you know. So now I'm going to kind of ask you about more specifically about your writing practice, and what I've kind of delineated into like 3 stages. Being the first being kind of like compositional, pre-writing, generative stage, and the second being the kind of revision stage, and then the third being the kind of organizational, archival stage, by which I mean like when things are starting to be finished and putting into books, and then what you do with those publications, and like kind of how you kind of work with that archival stuff. And so if does that make sense about your,
sure,
if that matches up with your writing process enough to talk, then if it doesn't,
sort of.
Usually it'll just kind of go, and I'll know what you'll probably answer questions that I have later, and then we'll
okay,
go forward.
Whatever.
So, what I'd like to talk about is kind of like how you were writing initially in the beginning parts of your career, and then I'll ask, and then kind of think about how that changed, and if there were sort of significant changes, where those were, and stuff like that. So, would you please describe kind of your typical compositional practices when you first started writing professionally, like at Iowa, and maybe a little past that area? How were you writing? Were you using handwriting? Were you using a typewriter? Did you keep a notebook, things like that?
I don't think I kept a notebook in those days. When I went to Iowa, I was writing 5 poems a week.
Oh, wow.
It was fun and easy. Hey, this is easy. And occasionally changing a word or two,
Okay.
and all by hand. I mean, I would have to type it up at some point, and that was on a typewriter in those days. A manual typewriter, I think. And that changed in my second year there. I guess I just hit a wall and saw that I could not write the poem that I hoped to write in one draft. Mm-hmm. And I began multiple drafting much more frequently and almost always. So most of the poems in my first book were written that way, not the old way.
And how did that work? Like kind of like just nitty-gritty wise?
Well, again, it's always been going back, and I mean, it's mostly handwritten. Yeah. Over and over and over and over and over again, starting from the beginning. I never have been able to do it any other way. Okay. First word first, first syllable first, all the way to the end. And sometimes I will have a whole, in fact, the happiest times, I will have a whole draft to work from. But, you know, there really isn't any way to formalize it because everyone's different. Yeah. Every single piece that I've ever written comes differently, has different problems. William Maxwell said he learned nothing about writing the next novel from writing the last one. And it does feel to me sort of like I'm inventing the wheel every time out. Yeah. And they just don't resemble each other. I've written poems in single drafts, you know, not very often, but I've also written 250 drafts of a poem and still not finished it, and it ends up in the brown box. And I have finished poems that I started 25 years earlier because for whatever reason, you know, my life has changed. I've changed a little, I hope, and saw the solution to the problem that was insoluble. It really is like doing problems, I think, at that stage of the composition, at least. The idea is kind of that you get something that compels you. Isn't that how it is? You just, it drives you through to its finish. And that finish may take a while or not, you know, it might take forms. There can be snags along the way, there can be endings that don't come, but it isn't, you know, linear. There's problems that occur, structural problems and so forth.
And then in terms of how this is going kind of physically, so you say you write a draft and then you never like go back and cross that out, or do you write another draft and another draft and another draft, all handwritten? I'm just trying to clarify.
No, I will cross things out or write in alternatives on the side.
On the one sheet of paper?
Yeah, I mean, I don't recopy the whole draft every single time, which I guess is what I indicated before. But if it's just, you know, messing with tweaks. Yeah. But sometimes, you know, the snag will get hit at line whatever, 5. And then I will start over again, or line 25, and you know, so I just have to have the whole thing in my head, and you know, at a certain point, but rarely before a whole draft is there, I will go to the computer and type it up, and then it helps to see it, print it out. I don't work on the screen. Okay. Print it out. And then work on it some more by hand.
And is the way that you do it with the computer now the same way you use the typewriter?
Essentially, yeah. I mean, I guess maybe sometimes I do make little changes on the screen. You know, if I'm typing it up again or something, you know, that will perhaps provoke a very probably minor changes. Changing an article or, you know.
Yeah, but nothing, never anything very substantial.
Well, usually not. I don't. Is my recollection of it.
And the handwriting, the composition pieces, where do they exist physically? Are they in a notebook? Are they on just regular pieces of paper? Or?
They're on yellow. Well, actually, I do two things.
Did that change over the?
You're making me see how idiosyncratic I am. I guess everybody probably is. Yeah. What I do is I take a piece of white typing paper. Mm-hmm. Usually it has something written on the other side of it. Okay. I will fold it in half and I will start writing on one side of it. And and if that goes on, if it's longer than that, I will go to the other side. Yeah. And then to store them, you know, I will shove them together, you know, the way that they can be folded inside, and the latest one will be on top. Yeah. But also, I will also write on yellow pads, and that'll come into the process. And then there's the typed sheets. It all sounds pretty chaotic when I say it, or really compulsively.
But is it usually that progression? It starts on the typing paper, moves to the yellow sheets, and then to the computer?
Well, it's various. Sometimes there are no yellow sheets. Okay. But it will always go from, I will never start composing a poem on the typewriter, on the computer, ever. That doesn't happen. It's always by hand. So it always goes that way.
Now, in terms of your prose work, does that start on the computer?
Mm-hmm. Okay. Yeah, for some reason I can write prose on the computer and prefer to write it on a computer because I can change. Will change a lot as I am writing, but why that would be specifically and, so distinct from one to the other is a mystery to me. Yeah. Maybe just because, but I wrote, I originally wrote prose by hand too. Okay. I only stopped writing it by hand, I think, about 20 years ago or so. I think I wrote Secret Life on the computer.
On the computer?
Maybe when computers came in.
That was that's actually what led you to the
I think writing. Mostly, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, that was in the 80s.
In the 80s, is that when you started?
Yeah, I had one of those enormous things with a huge processor.
Yeah. Did you note a difference once you weren't using the typewriter anymore and you moved to the computer? Was there, what did that?
The great thing about it was that you could make changes.
Yeah.
And you didn't have to retype the whole thing, which is what you had to do.
Right.
Before that.
And had you composed prose longhand? I mean, did you ever do
that? Yes, Okay. Most of the essays in my book of essays,
were composed longhand,
which was published in 2000, were composed longhand.
And those essays, though, were they written initially earlier? I'm assuming quite much earlier.
Quite a few of them were. Okay. And maybe the last ones in it were composed on computer. Okay. That's in fact likely.
Yeah. So the computer came in kind of the late 80s. Did you notice as computing power and computers got more powerful, did anything change then, or does it feel basically the same since the first time?
Well, that first time before you were born.
No, I was born.
Yeah, but they were so slow. But
Yeah.
at the time it seemed like magic, and just the being able to change it. So, yeah, of course it's changed. Everything is accelerated, and you can look up stuff and look up definitions of words. I would often write with a dictionary. I never have called a poem finished before I looked up most of the words in the poem.
Yeah.
I like to see how the etymologies work in relationship to one another before I call something finished.
Okay.
So now you can do a lot of that on the computer.
And have you moved from using physical dictionaries to?
I still have them. They're next to my chair upstairs, so I still like to do that. But yeah, I'm not systematic about it. I will look up things on the computer too.
So when you first started using a computer, were you also all the time though you were always printing out? You never really worked on the screen, even in those early days with the kind of.
Yes.
And now we're going to move kind of to the revision section, and we're talking about both, and that's fine.
Okay.
So you spoke some about your revision practices when you first started at being fairly small. What prompted the sort of the change to move into a more robust kind of revision strategy?
Well, the poem that I needed, could see to write, couldn't be written in a single draft. So I just had to I guess I got something that felt rich enough and compelling enough to keep pounding. And that did seem to create a sort of breakthrough for me.
And did you learn this revision technique? Was it sort of, did other people influence you in developing this, or was it something you kind of developed on?
Well, I had been taking workshop at the University of Iowa for a year, but it's not my memory that we ever really spoke about that. And so it was really compelled from the inside out. It was more the piece just wouldn't yield, and yet it wasn't going to be thrown away either. There was something in it. So I don't know, my relationship to the whole enterprise shifted. I just started working more slowly in the sense of no less, probably in fact more, and no more slowly. It just got finished a lot more slowly. And there were a lot less poems, and now I write very few. I mean, I write a lot of poems still, but it seems like 1 out of 100 starts comes to fruition at most.
Okay. And is your sort of style of revision, is it are you adding, or are you subtracting, or are you sort of substituting, or is it a combination of those?
I am pushing into it.
Okay.
I am pushing as far down into it and as far out as I can. I mean, with attention to all the aspects of poetry as I understand it and hope that the poem embodies. Richard Wilbur said, my intention in writing a poem is to exhaust the subject. I don't ignore that. I don't ignore, in my own mind at least, anything. I want everything to be, working on 8 cylinders, and of course I never achieve that. It's an impossible ideal. But I'm trying to go into the language, I'm trying to go deeper into the subject, I'm trying to make the story, if there is one, or one implicit, I'm working with every aspect of it. But it's essentially, you know, getting a line that might be a beginning and it containing everything else.
Yeah.
That's the weird and sort of mystical aspect. It's all in that piece that is driving you to complete it.
Yeah. And how do those lines come to you?
Randomly. Sometimes when I'm reading, I was reading this morning and it sparked something that probably, and I wrote it down, but it probably will never see the light of day.
Yeah.
Middle of the night, I have to get up out of bed, turn on the light, write down the line, almost never sees the light of day.
Yeah.
You know, and I have various repositories for these lines, but it's gotten pretty disorganized too. I used to be a lot better at keeping them in one place, but I do try to dig it all out. Yeah. And look at it sometimes, especially when I'm dry or because of teaching, haven't been able to work on my writing for a while. So to get started again, I will just look at all this, what to me is raw material. Yeah. But raw material can come from anywhere. It can come from somebody else's writing too, but it's mostly got to come from my own.
And so for like a line that you wake up in the middle of the night to write down, what do you write it down on?
Well, I can write it in my journal. I keep a journal now, a handwritten journal. And, or I can just write it on a piece of folded paper.
How is the journal relating to the writing at this point? Have you been doing that your whole career, or is that a...
No, I've been doing that for about the last 15 years. The journal for me is a separate enterprise. It's just the kind of vomiting that I probably wouldn't want anybody else to ever read. Yeah. But there's stuff in it sometimes. You know, I have gone through the exhausting narcissistic process of rereading the journals sometimes, and right now what I've started doing is I write the journal in black ink, and if there's something that I want to remember for writing, prose, poetry, I will underline it in blue so that I can go back through it and see what those things are.
Okay. So you say that the pieces, you're still writing a lot, but there are a lot fewer that are kind of coming up to that level. I mean, how has that changed over the course of your career? Were there more kind of bubbling up, or do you have higher standards at this point?
It's not really standards.
Okay. Yeah,
I mean, I want it to be as good as it can be, always. Yeah. So the standard is, you know, that's the standard. Whether or not I ever achieve it or how often I do is unfortunately not for me to say. Because I would say, you know, that it pretty much either achieves that standard and simultaneously doesn't. Yeah. You know, again, it's just my audience for a poem is the poem. I don't what anybody else thinks of it, or even what I think of it. Yeah. Doesn't matter at all to me. What I want to do is get the poem to come off of the page and become a thing. So, you know, again, whether or not I'm doing that, that's sort of the illusion that I'm under.
How do you know when it's a thing?
I don't know, except I do know. I mean, I'm talking like a Zen.
Yes, yes. Well, it is almost sort of.
I mean, I don't really know how to answer that because, again, it depends upon the piece, so it's contingent.
Yeah.
But it feels and seems, and it's, I interrogate my work brutally. I would never want anyone to talk to anyone else the way that I talk to my poems.
Okay.
I ask them at every moment, are you interesting? Are you interesting? Are you interesting? Is this engaging? Mm-hmm. Every nanosecond of the piece, I want it to be. Keats said in his letters he wanted to load every rift with ore. And he was talking about sound mostly in that particular context. But that's what I want to do. Every moment provides an opportunity. And you just don't want to lose your attention to that. So that's...
And has your definition of interesting become slimmer as your practice has been going forward, or?
I think it's actually become wider.
Okay.
I mean, I think I'm a little bit, not much, but a little less obsessive and a little less tunnel visioned than I was when I was younger. But my taste has not really changed in music, in painting, in poetry, in, I've discovered new things along the way, but I'm embarrassingly consistent and hidebound.
So what role do other people play in your revision process?
Well, I have trusted readers, that some of whom I've had for a very, very long time. Mm-hmm. I think what you want in a reader is somebody who loves your work and maybe loves you, but will tell you the truth about a piece. And even to the point of saying, this really doesn't work at all and it belongs in the bone pile. But will tell you at every place that doesn't work for them. And you can almost take, and then if you can get a group of these responses, then you can see which ones are useful. I've changed things because of those responses, but I also have not changed things.
And how does that work kind of on a logistical way? Has that changed pretty dramatically?
No, it hasn't.
Okay.
It's just a question. I mean, it's like going to a shrink or something, or talking to a friend or a spouse. It gives you new eyes.
Yeah.
You need new eyes to and then you're able to process that response because it's concrete. It's not abstract. You can only interrogate it so far by yourself, and then you need somebody to tell you this is working or this isn't.
Yeah. And in terms of are you now sending these over email?
Yeah.
Okay. And before, when there was
it was
no
through
email,
mail.
Through regular mail,
Uh-huh.
but it's a similar process.
Same thing.
Same thing.
Really.
Do you find the immediacy of email has changed it, or it's?
We've become terribly spoiled by the immediacy of email. I mean, you send something off and you expect something's going to come back in the next three minutes. And if it's something you're particularly looking for, you check your email 712 times a day, or, so it takes a real discipline for me not to do that, because I would spend all my time doing it otherwise.
So this is the kind of organizational, archival portion of this thing. How do you kind of keep track of all the work that you have coming from beginning to end?
Well,
like say just a one poem, for instance. do you just have? I mean, do you have many going at the same time, or are you always working on one and then that comes and then you move on to the next?
I never have been able to do more than one thing at a time, ever. And so if I'm working on an essay, that's all I'm working on. If I'm working on a poem, that's all I'm working on. If I'm working on a nonfiction piece, that's all I'm doing. I just don't have the capacity. I might, still have lines of poems in the middle of the night, or come to me and I will write them down, but I don't work on those. I never bring anything to completion. Stop this and do this and go back to that. Okay. I just have to totally immerse myself in what I'm doing.
And so once that becomes, version 10 or whatever on the computer, and then you're moving on to the next, how do those then coalesce into a collection?
Well, I have the final drafts of each of the poems. At a certain point, most books of poems are about 40 poems, about 50, 60 pages, at least mine are. And so usually somewhere in the 30s, the book will start to take shape. There might be a number of those that won't make it into the book. Some will seem too weak. I published quite a few poems in magazines that didn't go into any collection ever. And so there is a process of winnowing at that point, and even more revision of individual pieces. But I will take it out of the folder that it's in. It'll be X10, Y25, or whatever the piece is, and then I'll take the final version and just save it into the book folder, and I'll work. I'm still working in the compositional folder, but it will then be, these are finished and these are going to go into a book.
And then when you are putting together the order, when you have maybe all of the poems ready, how do you go about?
Well, printing, they'll all be printed out in the final versions, and I will mess with them. I'll mess with the paper. I couldn't do it any other way.
Yeah. And do you have any rituals or things for doing that? I mean, do you put them all out on a wall or something like that, or?
I've heard of people who do that spread them out on the floor and stuff, but I've never done that. I do make sometimes arbitrary decisions. I basically don't like, though I used it early on, sections. I don't do that anymore. I don't think it's in my last book, but actually I should probably check. My preference is for it to be one thing.
So I guess so some of this collection work did change over the course, and that, just small things, but like you not using sections anymore and things like that. Have you noticed any other changes from your earlier career to now?
In terms of?
Composing, say, the book as a whole once you're at that finished stage.
No. I can't really say so. It's again a process of trying to realize it as best you can, and also not publish it until it's ready to be published. And I certainly didn't choose to be to take. It was it's about 10 years between books of poems on the average, but I also did write 3 other books, so they took some time as well. But I have never been anxious to put something out before I was happy with it.
Okay, so that's sort of the basic sort of process portion. Is there anything else you think you should mention or we should talk about before? I mean, this is going to get a little bit of that. This is kind of another sort of short answer, like a lot of those computer questions.
Mm-hmm. Well, no.
No,
I
that's
mean,
fine.
there's also infinite subjects to talk about, but I think the most interesting part of this for thinking about making it into a magazine thing is the questions about composition.
Yeah, yeah. These are kind of the more, I guess, blunter questions about computer use, and I think we've answered some of this. So when did you start using computers kind of on a regular basis? Late '80s?
Probably mid '80s.
Mid '80s?
It was pretty early.
Okay. And how did you have access to a computer? Was it a personal computer?
I bought it.
You bought it?
Yeah. Cost a lot of money too. At least I didn't have much at the time.
Yeah. What drove you to make that purchase if it was a larger one?
Friends had told me, who were writers, said that you got to do this. This is amazing and wonderful, and do it. And the program assistant at Warren Wilson knew computers, and so I could take some tutorials with her, and she showed me how to do it. And a lot of the writers, that's a low residency program, 2 weeks every 6 months. A lot of the writers were going to her at the time. And
so was it this, did you agree with your friends that it was this great thing to have once you had it?
Again, it was great to be able to change things without typing them all out again. And that's pretty much all you could do with it. There was no internet, there was no email. All it was a word processor.
Do you think then, did that have any effect on your style or on your process?
Not that I could track. I wrote letters first on the computer. It was still snail mail.
Yeah.
And so I was composing letters on the computer, but I would compose letters on the typewriter too. I had always done that and not written letters by hand. I had always typed them. But I liked being able to, you see me doing this with my fingers, I like being able to do that. And I think that's what led me to start composing prose on the computer, because it was easier for me to write.
Yeah.
Just physically.
I guess I wonder, especially with, I know you've been working in kind of, rhyme verse and formal rhyme verse since the beginning, but I feel like it's increased more as you've gotten in your later career. I wonder, that was one of the things I was wondering when I was reading your stuff again for this question. It doesn't seem though that the computer really has any play in that. I thought there might be an easier way to work with rhyme or anything like that, but that's not, you're still mostly doing that all on paper.
Yes, but I have looked up, I confess, rhyming pairs. There's rhyming dictionaries online.
Yeah.
So sometimes I have used those and just to see what the options are. I want to write a rhymed poem as if you don't even know it's rhymed, unless it's purposeful that you do know that it's rhymed. And so that aspect of it, but in terms of composition, no.
Okay. How has your relationship with the computer changed? And I guess that's a very weird question, but also I guess I'm wondering how you feel about the files themselves. Were you always kind of conscientious in trying to save them, or are they more of a means to an end?
I don't really think about them much. I think I've had a few computers crash.
Mm-hmm.
I don't remember. Did I ever lose anything? I don't recall. I don't think so. Not poetry,
yeah.
Anyway. So it's just, what did I do before computers? How did I save stuff? I think just in a folder, and I still do that. I still keep a physical folder of finished poems. I have the poems I've finished since this morning, the ones that
This morning, the book, not
this
morning.
Right. Yeah, that would be a lot for me. Since 2012, they're in just a file folder upstairs. The paper copies finished the final drafts of.
Do you have any kind of like, and this is a weird, these are all, do you have any sort of dear feelings for, like, say, maybe some of the paper, or maybe the handwritten work, or any of that? Do you try to protect it? Do you kind of give it extra attention, or in any way?
Well, I do invite it to dinner every once in a while and take it to a movie when it feels neglected, and I pet it sometimes and speak very soft, kind words. No.
Has there been any, the computer allows more kind of an ease of sort of typographical flourishes. Have you ever used anything, or used any of those options on the computer?
No.
No? Do you use spell check?
No. But I don't have spell check. I mean, the program will underline something in red if it's misspelled.
Right.
If it's misspelled, I'll correct the spelling, but I don't think I even have an automatic. Maybe I do. I don't know. I've never used it. I won spelling bees.
Are you when you're writing? Are you connected? Well, you kind of compose mostly on the computer. I guess when you're typing it out, are you connected to the internet? Are you using the internet in any way with the poem?
A poem.
Mm-hmm. Or with prose, I mean, either way.
Well, in the act of writing, again, for the most part, when I'm on the computer for a poem, I'm not composing, so I'm just typing. And then I might use the internet to look up a word, or I've never really been conscious particularly of the process. When I've written prose that involves reference to something, or I'm trying to think of what the thing is that I want it to refer to, I will look up stuff. The process of composing, well, I guess I'm inside of it in the same way. I'm trying to make it, work it, and make it rich in all the same ways, except the relationships among the language and structure and what you can do in a poem that you can't in a piece of prose, and vice versa. Mm-hmm. But I will. I don't have any rule about it, but I will go to something if I need to.
And do you remember, or can you pinpoint a time when the internet became more of an important part of your, working or writing life?
I don't even really remember very well. We went to France in 1997, and there was no internet.
Yeah.
So that's 17 years ago? We had no email. There was, I think internet was just kind of beginning. Yeah. Here I remember a friend of mine whose wife is a novelist saying that his wife had sent her novel to her agent over the wire. And that was about that time, and I thought, my God, that's amazing. So, yeah, I don't really remember when it came in to such a degree that it became something resembling what it is today. It seems like it was a very gradual process.
Do you note, like, in maybe different books or in your relationship with publishers that there was a difference in the change? I mean, so I'm guessing your book of essays came out in 2000. So did you interact with the publisher there online, or did you do that with the Selected?
As I recall, there was email very shortly after we came back from France in 1997.
Yeah.
So like those last 3 years of the century, email kind of just became started to become the mode of communication. And yes, I was working with a copy editor who lived in San Diego, and we would send things back and forth and to the publisher, which was in Georgia. And yeah, it was all in place by then.
Do you ever worry about the security or sort of fixity of the computer files that you have now, save the poems? Is that a conscious concern or something you just...
Like someone would get into it?
I guess more like the computer would crash and you would lose them.
Well, I have paper copies. And recovery methods are pretty sophisticated for hard disks. I have an old laptop in my closet that I thought to get the hard disk transcribed to a newer computer. I just have never done it. It's probably impossible now. It was way out of date. But outside of that one, which I think did crash, I've just taken whatever's on the hard disk of the old one and transferred it to the hard disk of the new one. And as I said, I believe this thing has automatic backup on it. I don't know how they do that, but I'm pretty ignorant of all this stuff, and willfully so. It just would suck up too much of my time to learn about it. But I do know writers who are really pretty expert, and probably it ends up using less of your time once you learn it. But I have a physical aversion to reading manuals. I can't do it. Yeah. So I have a computer guy, very nice guy. If any of us, my wife, my daughter, or I have any problems, I call him up. He's usually here within a couple hours.
Okay. How often do you see this gentleman?
Well, only when we have a problem. But he also has that Log Me In, I think it's called. So he has all three of our computers access to everything on them from his office.
Okay.
So I hope he continues to like me. I overpay him, and
That's probably why.
Yeah, I think so. He has access to everything on all the computers.
Okay.
So I'm not sure if that's ridiculous or not, but he's a
How did you establish this relationship?
He works for the school,
okay,
but he does this for us privately.
Okay.
So I met him through his working for the School of Humanities. Very sweet guy.
And then you talked a little bit about the correspondence changing from snail mail to email. Do you feel like you do more correspondence now with email, or is it about the same throughout your career?
Well, as you know, it's a completely different animal.
Yeah.
I mean, it doesn't have a a lot of emails have no addressee
Yeah.
and no complimentary close is what we called it in fourth grade. Sincerely, Michael.
Yeah.
So people write to 3 words or one sentence or for an answer to an immediate question. It's nothing like a letter. You wouldn't write a letter like that.
In terms of the correspondence you have with fellow writers and things like that, what is there a marked change in that correspondence as well?
When I'm responding to somebody's manuscript, I would say there is no change.
Okay.
So I will write them a letter.
Yeah.
Essentially, what would the exact same thing that would have been sent through the mail. But other things, personal correspondence, tends to be a lot briefer. I mean, and I will still try to be funny in emails. I mean, that's actually the thing I do the most.
Yeah.
And I can also send people hilarious stuff from YouTube or whatever, and I get those back, and sometimes I'll send jokes or whatever. So there's changes, there's also similarities, but because it's so much faster and so much easier and so much you can make it shorter. And
mm-hmm. In terms of your own sort of reading and thinking, have you found the computer a boon to finding new work or to finding new writers to read or anything like that?
I don't like to read off a screen.
Yeah.
If I really want to read something, if it's an article in a newspaper or something, I will usually print it out. Also, I'm having some physical problems using computers.
Okay.
I'm probably heading for a shoulder surgery this summer, and so it's not physically comfortable to spend too much time on it. But mostly even before that, I don't like to read off the screen. I like to read off a page.
What is the difference, do you feel? For yourself,
That's a very good question. It just feels like I like having a physical thing in my hands to read from. That's native to me. I mean, this screens didn't come in any significant way until about 15 years ago, So I was reading for many years, probably 50 or so before that happened. I would imagine that kids are perfectly happy reading off the screen. My daughter texts her friends all the time and gets texts and emails, and I don't text anybody. I don't do text.
Mm-hmm.
It just doesn't. I'm like my grandmother with the telephone.
And then I guess sort of I have a little bit on teaching and then this kind of month ending. But have you seen with the computer rise and with all that, has your teaching changed pretty fundamentally, or has it stayed similar?
Oh man, it's well, it's a teacher's nightmare insofar as you can be contacted any time of the night or day, and you can't live teaching without email. It's not possible anymore. It's just assumed that you're going to get notices from school, you're going to get communications, you just simply would not be able to function. You would be, because when this technology, and this is a commonplace, exists, it just makes the other technology completely obsolete. So the way people communicated with you before, when I was teaching before the advent of all of this stuff, none of those communications would come through that means, and now all of them do. So it isn't that you can just stop.
Yeah.
and get them from other sources because they don't come from other sources. So, you know, all the emails I get from the chair of the English department that go out to every member of the English department, they don't appear in my mailbox.
Right.
Which before I would get, you know, every 4 days that I went into school.
Yeah.
And the assumption of the time frame has radically changed and compressed. So it's so much more of your attention that is really necessary for me to limit that.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I don't have an iPhone, I have a dumb phone, and I don't want emails following me around all day.
Yeah. I'd like to drop mine off. Did this kind of, I guess, greater reach of email and the sort of technological stuff that we've become accustomed to, has that changed your writing in any way? I mean, has that impacted your time? Has that impacted your attention?
I would like to think not, but again, there's an addictive quality to being sitting on the computer that I have noticed, that I'm, you know, check my email and then I will look at the weather. Mm-hmm. And then I want to see what the headlines in the New York Times are, and I'm sitting there, and why get up?
Yeah.
And so it has that quality of really drawing you into being in relationship with it.
Yeah.
There was a survey in The Guardian, which is a newspaper I read every once in a while. Well, almost every day I will look at it. Mm-hmm. And the question was, would you rather give up sex or your computer for the rest of your life? And guess what 70% of the people answered.
Wow.
So if that isn't insane, I don't know what is,
yeah.
Or something. Maybe the two are coterminous for people. But it's really become something radically different.
Do you feel that your students have changed in their kind of cultural, technological understandings or relationships with you since the rise of the internet?
No, I wouldn't say that. They can contact me at any time, but that's fine with me. I mean, they respect me. I actually contact them more than they contact me, and they're very, very considerate of my time and my attention, yeah. You know, so it's not really a problem. It's just, I think their relationship to technology is very different from mine. They were talking the other day and at a pause in the workshop about how many of they're still doing Facebook. They're in their I've never done Facebook. I never would do Facebook. Facebook is my worst nightmare. The idea that anybody, you know, I still get emails from strangers and
yeah.
people I used to know and all this stuff, and I don't want any of that
yeah.
stuff. And but they were saying they do Facebook, but the undergraduates, their students, 4 years younger than them, Facebook is passé. They don't do Facebook. They do whatever it is. So the whole thing just kind of and I am very much like my grandmother, still screaming into the phone, because the way she had phones, which didn't come in till she was in her pretty old to start with, was you had to crank it and you had to shout into the thing.
Yeah.
And so she just kept doing that, even when she didn't have to.
Yeah. And then, so I think just finally, you know, this is sort of my blunt ending question. Do you have any kind of thoughts as to what's really changed with the advent of computers in relationship to writing? I mean, has there been a change in your opinion, or do you see it as something that has simply transferred kind of analog practices into a virtual environment?
Well, I'm not sure that I'm educated enough to answer that question, but and the area that it affects most, that is most important to me is poetry.
Yeah.
And in fact, I think there's a great opportunity. Poems always, the convention, and it's an artificial convention. But for the last, how many 100 years, at least probably 200, maybe even a little more than that, have been published in the form of books.
Yeah.
That's just the way poems have primarily appeared. Also, individual poems have, over the last X years, appeared in magazines.
Mm-hmm.
Now I had a poem, I've had a number of poems published only online. Mm-hmm. Some of those poems have been accompanied by audio versions of the poems. Some of the poems have video versions of. It seems to me that, where this all could go, and I have no better idea than anyone else, is, I hope books don't stop existing. It's one of those technologies like a bicycle that seems like it will never go out. It's a good technology. But clearly they're also being published, poems are also being published in other forms. And I have published 5 books, and yet there's probably 75, 80, 90, most of the contents of my books are on the web right now without my permission. I mean, they are just there. So anybody who wants to read poems by me or any other poet can find them right there, and they won't be in book form. They will be individual poems. And for me, poetry is very much an auditory experience. When I'm composing, I say them out loud in a kind of quiet voice. I like to read poems out loud. I like to hear them read out loud. I think you get a different apprehension of them than just reading them silently. So all that to me is for the good. I like hearing poems online. And I like seeing poets read online, but that's less important to me than being able to hear them. So that could really serve to make poems perhaps less like prose. This so technology.
That access to the auditory experience is immediate as the printing page.
Exactly. And you can read it and listen to it at the same time if you want.
And then I'm just sort of interested. So, like when you're composing, you're also reading it out loud, like line by line. So
I
as
do.
You're writing the words.
I always do that.
You always do that.
It's like a little whisper.
Okay. So that's interesting. Okay. I think that's it.
All done?
Yeah.
Good.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Devin. That was fun. And fun is important.
Yes, it is.
I hope I got everything.
You did, and this looks like it worked. So that's good.
Hooray. I've been having to go to the bathroom.